Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the content patch for the 4th of Feb 2013. My name is TotalBiscuit. With today's gaming news and comments coming up in the show, Team Fortress 2's item profits have been revealed, Microsoft XNA to be retired, Ironclad Games CEO believes RTS is a dying market, and CD Projekt RED unveils new engine. During his recent talk at the University of Texas in Austin, the CEO of Valve, Gabe Newell, talked in detail about the community-created content system within Team Fortress 2 and the amount of money that was actually being made from it. He said, quote, "To be really concrete, 10 times as much content comes from the user base as comes from Valve. We think that we're super productive and badass at making TF2 content, but even at this early stage, we cannot compete with our customers in the production of content for this environment." He went on to give some concrete numbers as to how much some of the players creating content for TF2 are making. He claimed that the most anyone has earned in a single year is $500,000, and that was their take-home pay after the revenue split with Valve themselves. He went on to say that in the first 2 weeks of actually doing this, they broke PayPal and were required to submit a large number of documents to indicate that they weren't simply money laundering. The system has become so significant that some countries, including South Korea, require a W-4 tax and income form to be submitted in order to actually use the system, and Valve itself has hired an economist to help manage the overall ecosystem of Team Fortress 2 item creation and sale. Now, to some people that might seem like fairly staggering numbers. I've got to say it actually kind of isn't. I think the only thing that's really surprised me is the number of these items that are actually being sold across the board. One would think that after the introduction of the free-to-play version that the vast majority of people would be playing the free version, not actually putting money into the TF2 economy, but it seems like more people than you might think actually are, and are purchasing these items. Now, as regards to the amount of money being made from some people, bear in mind, of course, that $500,000 is not representative of the average item creator. We're talking about the top-tier guys that are making the most popular and interesting and entertaining stuff. Now, again, it might sound like a lot, but you've got to bear in mind that a lot of these revenue share-based models can actually go up to ludicrous amounts of money very quickly, dependent on the volume in question. There's a reason why high-volume YouTube channels that actually have a lot of views every day make a good amount of money, simply because you've got to think about the amount of advertising that is sold on those channels, and then think about the take-home amount that you would get as a producer versus what Google makes, right? And this is the same kind of principle with this, only them actually selling a product rather than the people watching it and playing it actually being the product. The crazy thing about this is that it's kind of both, really. You've got the customers creating the content to sell to other customers that Valve is making money from in and of itself. It's kind of a genius system, really, when you think about it. So it doesn't surprise me that much that they're making a reasonable amount of money here. But what I would say is it's very, very likely that we're going to see this spread as a direct result. Valve has managed to nail this market down prior to pretty much anybody else. And there's a lot of companies, no doubt, that are very much kicking themselves over the fact that they didn't jump on the bandwagon with user-created content sooner. What's worse now is that the best and most popular way to create that content is via the Steam Workshop system, which means that even if games do wish to implement a system which allows customers to create items that they can then sell to other customers within the actual game itself, the chances are they're probably going to want to use the Steam Workshop because it has the most established user base and already has these systems in place. So at that point, Valve then takes another cut. So God, if you're EA right now, you're kicking yourself in the arse for thinking, why the hell didn't we do this earlier with our system? Not to mention, of course, that console manufacturers must be thinking, yeah, this could have worked out pretty well for us. Now, I don't think that this works in all games, but the amount of free-to-play games that could benefit from this is absolutely staggering. This is the kind of situation where you could not only reduce your costs if you happen to be a producer making a free-to-play game, but you could also create this really healthy economy whereby there's such a large amount of cool cosmetic stuff that you can support your game without having to resort to practices which are perceived by some people as pay to win, which include, of course, the sale of various items, weapons, and boosts. Now, that's not to say that these practices are pay to win, but you've got to consider how much better potentially a game would be if it didn't have that. Now, in the past, I've said that Valve was in a pretty unique position, and I have a feeling that this is exactly why. I said that Dota 2 was very much a loss leader for them, and I still believe that to some degree, and it's very hard to compete with that, but that's only because Valve has gotten so smart that they put all of these systems in place prior to it. I didn't think I fully realized until I actually read articles like this just how important the item creation system really is, and just how many items there actually are available for Team Fortress 2 and Dota 2 as a direct result of this. And think about the relatively low overheads for this as well when it comes to content creation. I mean, essentially you're just curating content rather than actually creating it. Now, I had a look at the legal notice at teamfortress2.com, and what that indicates is that you are paid 25% of the adjusted gross revenue. So that means that, bearing in mind all sorts of different factors, let's just go for a ballpark figure here, it's a 75% take-home for Valve on an item that someone other than them has actually made. Obviously, they have to implement it into the game in some way, but the way that they've created the workshop tools makes that much quicker and much easier. And as a direct result, they are actually making bank on this. If you think about it for a second, just do the basic mathematics. $500,000 take-home for some of the top creators. That means the gross revenue is like $2 million, and Valve is taking 1.5. Now, in comparison to the rest of its service, that's probably not a lot, but if you could even make a fraction of that with another free-to-play game, then that's pretty significant. And that's just like one creator. There's so many creators currently working essentially for Valve and taking the minority of the money for the majority of the work done. It's a pretty genius idea. I think if games can successfully do that and actually get enough talented creators on board, then you could actually have some free-to-play games that are essentially driven entirely by cosmetic sales and not actually by the sale of items that could be perceived buying of power. I don't know if there's a lot of games that could really pull this off, though. It comes back down to the original point, really, that Valve is most likely the only company big enough and with the right kind of attitude and ecosystem to create this. There's the possibility that if Blizzard were to set something like this up, it might work. Maybe it could work with Riot as well. But you'd have to have a pretty big game in order to actually support this to begin with, which means if you launch with this idea in mind, then you won't necessarily be successful unless your game actually reaches that nice critical mass of players that are willing to pay on a regular basis for cool cosmetics. It's been learned that Microsoft will be retiring its XNA runtime environment, a toolset designed to allow you to develop games for Xbox 360, Windows, and Windows Phone, and successfully publish them on the platform in April 2014. While the system will still be supported up to that point, there are no plans for future developments of it, and a Microsoft representative claimed, "No one wants to learn a dying technology, and a big part of XNA's appeal was the prospect of selling a game on Xbox Live, even if that wasn't the most commercially sensible thing to do." According to Promit Roy, a technical lead at Action Equals Reaction Labs, quoted as a source by computerandvideogames.com, "If there are no advocates of the technology, and we infer from the lack of internal support in Microsoft that there will be no Xbox Live indie games on the next-gen machine, there is no one to drive XNA adoption and no incentive to actually learn it." This is, of course, perhaps the most shocking potential news, that the Xbox Live indie games system will not actually be included in the next generation of hardware, although it remains to be seen as to whether or not they will use a different kind of technology and keep this system within Xbox Live Arcade itself. Now, if you want to know what kind of games were developed using XNA, stuff like Fez was developed using that, Bastion was developed using XNA, as well as Skulls of the Shogun and Dust and Elysian Tale. Without getting too technical, it's essentially a really nice framework which allows indie game companies to develop something which is compatible with things like PC, Xbox 360, as well as the Windows Phone. Although it looks like the Windows Phone is getting royally shafted by this. This is a device that's only really just started to gain adoption, and it looks like a system that was being used to develop for it will be phased out fairly shortly. It's not really good news. Also, according to the letter acquired by Computer and Video Games, which was also confirmed by a representative for Microsoft, while part of the letter indicated that development on DirectX, the technology used to drive an awful lot of games graphics hardware, would also be ceasing, Microsoft claimed that it is actively investing in DirectX as a unified graphics foundation for all of our platforms, including Windows, Xbox 360, and Windows Phone. DirectX is evolving and will continue to evolve. We have have absolutely no intention of stopping innovation with DirectX. Bear in mind, all of this news essentially comes from an email which refers to the internal MVP award program and the retirement of XNA and DirectX from said program. So, yeah, a lot of digging went into this from various sites, and there was some confirmation, of course, that XNA would not, in fact, be continuing when it comes to its support and its development. Now, I've got to say that it's definitely unfortunate that XNA is going to be lacking support in future for the people that actually spent a lot of time learning the bloody thing. So if they invested an awful lot into the development of their XNA skills in order to create games, then they're going to be sold up the creek without a paddle fairly quickly. However, what I will also say is that the way that Microsoft actually implemented its Xbox Live indie game system was nothing short of terrible. There are very few games on that service that made an awful lot of money, and the ones that did are mostly Minecraft clones. Microsoft did very little to actually promote Xbox Live indie games on the Xbox Live service, and was focused more on its sort of premium indie arcade titles, which included things like Fez, as well as, of course, Bastion, which came out first on Xbox 360, and a variety of other games. So you had these lower tier games that were essentially ignored and just put out on Xbox Live indie games to die. If this is the kind of support that we could expect from Microsoft on the next generation of hardware, then quite frankly, I'm pretty happy that they decided to retire this, because I would rather it not be there at all than have a half-arsed system. And that's very much what Xbox Live indie games actually consisted of. Saying any more than that is really just speculation. It's entirely possible that Microsoft will come up with a better system in order to encourage indie game development for the Xbox platform in the next generation of hardware, but that all remains to be seen, and by the looks of it, we'll most likely be waiting for E3 in order to find out what's going on there. Speaking with Rock Paper Shotgun, Blair Fraser, the director and co-owner of Ironclad, the guys that made Sins of a Solar Empire, has claimed that the real-time strategy genre is in fact dying. Quote, "It's a dying market. RTSs, to my mind, are very niche now, and that's unfortunate because that's what I love and that's what I grew up playing," he claimed. "That's also what I make, or made anyway. I just think the demographics have changed. Company of Heroes may be profitable, and StarCraft 2 is an anomaly, but most of them aren't going to get big numbers." When asked as to why he believed that his title, Sins of a Solar Empire, which is considered by many to be an RTS, is still doing well, he claims that it moved away from the traditional RTS model. Studio's next title, Sins of a Solar Empire, is a MOBA or Dota clone title. He also went on to discuss Age of Empires Online, and indeed he claimed he can tell us why Age of Empires Online went out of business. Quote, "They had to hit a certain price point that free-to-play players find valuable. The Team Fortress 2 High 5 animation was the same price as an entire faction in Age of Empires Online. The return on investment there just doesn't make any sense, and that's why Age of Empires Online isn't generating any more content, and that's why we're not charging for army-type units in Sins of a Dark Age." That's an interesting quote, especially considering that we were talking a little bit about the free-to-play stuff with TF2 earlier. So the claim is here that the factions were actually too cheap, and that's actually why the game failed. That's kind of mind-boggling, really, when you think about it. I'm not entirely sure that that is a particularly accurate statement. I mean, honestly, it seems like the cost of a faction in that game was pretty damn reasonable, but the fact of the matter is that TF2 just has a much larger audience, and it's also an audience that is comfortable with buying stuff that is entirely cosmetic, because everything else within the game is entirely free and accessible. So even if you don't want to pay for weapons, you can still get them in another way. You want to play another faction on Age of Empires Online, well, you can't really do that. So I don't think you can really compare the two. It's a completely different player base and a completely different culture. TF2 is not a traditional free-to-play game. It is, in fact, an anomaly. I also don't really agree with what he's saying in terms of RTS actually being a dying genre. It's more of a self-fulfilling prophecy, really. It's a dying genre because there aren't all that many games in it, not because the actual market itself stagnated. Have people moved away from the desire to actually play RTS? Possibly. But at the end of the day, it's not like they really have many choices when it comes to engaging in actual RTS multiplayer gaming. What have you got to play? You have StarCraft, you've got the older Company of Heroes games. The Dawn of War 2 scene is pretty close to dead, but it's still around. Then you've got Age of Empires Online, which is not getting content developed for it anymore, and honestly had a few too many PvE elements, in my opinion, to really be a solid RTS title. You don't have that many choices. There's some smaller indie games of stuff, of course, like Wargame European Escalation. That's a pretty good game, but honestly kind of a little bit niche since it tips itself towards the wargame style as opposed to more traditional base-building RTS. I don't think there's really enough statistics to really prove that it's a dying genre simply because of those lack of games. Studios simply aren't developing these games anymore, and as a direct result, we just simply do not know how successful this stuff will be. Also, the dip towards the free-to-play market is a little bit weird because for straight-up RTS, it's very hard to create a free-to-play RTS title that still actually hits all the points in terms of what makes a good RTS game. How do you do that? Do you sell factions? Because apparently with Age of Empires Online that didn't really work out all that well. Do you sell units? Well, that leads to horrible situations of pay to win and all sorts of other things. Plus, limiting the tactical options of free players is never a good idea because they're more likely to simply get bored with the game because they only have one or two viable builds available to them. Plus, they will rapidly get sick of it if they feel they're being beaten by people that are just paying money to do so. Also, a lot of people just play RTS to play single-player campaigns and skirmish modes with bots. They actually don't want to go online because RTS Online is pretty damn hard. It's a very stressful experience for a lot of players. So, free-to-play games don't lend themselves well to that either because generally they don't have a big single-player campaign. There are forthcoming free-to-play RTSs that are very much premium. We're talking about Company of Heroes 2. Also, Generals 2 is coming out in the Command & Conquer franchise. But up to this point, we haven't seen a really good example of a free-to-play RTS that actually works across all levels and actually appeals to everyone that really likes real-time strategy gaming. If big respected development houses are not making RTS games, then obviously we're not going to have a very healthy RTS community. We're not seeing more games in the Age of Empires franchise when it comes down to the traditional model. Age of Empires 3 was the last one to be developed in the traditional sense, sold in a box, and then of course we had the free-to-play version. Same with Command & Conquer. CNC4 was a disaster. It wasn't even close to being a good RTS, and then the next one is going to be a free-to-play game. Will that be any good? Well, that remains to be seen. So, which games are we going to see that actually involve just selling a box to you? Right now, it's pretty much just the expansions for StarCraft 2 and Company of Heroes 2, plus any other Dawn of War game that happens to come in your general direction. The non-traditional stuff, like the Total War series, well, some people don't even consider that to be real-time strategy. It is more of a light war game. God, it's so hard to really judge this, which is why I don't really think you should be throwing out statements like RTS is dead. You can say the same thing about arena shooters and arcade-style FPS. It really just requires a few successful games in that genre to revitalize it, as it were, and there are more games that are dipping back towards the arcade style of FPS away from MMS, and we're seeing some success in that, including, of course, the new Serious Sam game, to a lesser degree, the revamp of Painkiller, and hopefully in future stuff like Rise of the Triad will do really, really well, and will result in stimulation of that particular market. But we do kind of need a killer app to kick that back into gear, and it can't be a Blizzard game, right? There's a reason why action RPGs with the hack-and-slash Diablo style are currently in and are doing pretty well, because Diablo 3 came out, it satisfied some people but not others, then Torchlight 2 came in, and then we get Path of Exile, and then we're going to be getting Grim Dawn. These are all games within that genre that seem to be quite successful and are stimulating the genre in and of itself, a genre that was very much dead, really, before the original Torchlight came out, and Titan Quest was really the only game within that genre that had actually done anything for it over the course of like a decade. So I think it's a little early to proclaim the death of this particular genre just yet. And finally, CD Projekt RED has announced that the newest version of its proprietary REDengine, REDengine 3, is in development and will bring, quote, a new level of realism to its upcoming titles. This comes a few days before they are rumored to be announcing a new title, which is considered by many to likely be The Witcher 3. This is all, of course, based on a little piece of hidden information that was snuck into the latest Cyberpunk 2077 trailer. CD Projekt Projekt claims that this new engine will allow players to roam freely around a large game world without loading times, with the aim to keep maximum levels of immersion and offer realistic face and body expressions, making character interaction more realistic. CD Projekt also released a shot rendered using the REDengine 3 of a battered coastline, which looks rather impressive to say the least, although of course with a low-resolution screenshot, it's pretty difficult to know just how much of an improvement this will be over the previous iteration of the REDengine, which of course powered the very visually impressive Witcher 2. Perhaps more exciting, of course, is the fact that CD Projekt RED is very much a PC-orientated developer, although they released perhaps one of the best PC to 360 conversions in history in the form of the Witcher 2 after a very lengthy development cycle. I don't know about you, but I'm very much looking forward to seeing what this thing can actually do. REDengine 2 was pretty damn impressive, honestly. I remember that game tanking my system when it first came out. Need to be optimized just a little bit, of course, but my god, that game was and still is one of the best looking video games ever made. So more of this. I'm so happy for CD Projekt, really I am. The fact that they've actually managed to pull this off is incredible, and they are of course one of the premier developers now with PC orientated stuff in mind that are actually pushing the envelope in terms of graphics technology. Okay, folks, that is me done for the day. Thank you very much for watching the content patch, and I'll see you next time.